He proposed in a boardroom. Not on one knee, not under twinkling lights, not even with a ring. He stood beside a digital projection of a merger port and said, "A union, personal and professional, makes perfect sense, doesn't it?" And in that sterile blue light, with the hum of the city pressing against the glass, I said yes, because back then I thought logic was love. My name is Alara Quinn, founder and CEO of Vossian Dynamics, a boutique tech firm that had clawed its way from an attic startup to a serious name in ethical AI. By 31, I had learned to speak the language of investors better than lovers, profit margins instead of promises, projections instead of passion. Then came Lennox Vale, charming, deliberate, and frighteningly persuasive. He was the kind of man who could turn an argument into a dance, make deceit sound like poetry. He entered my orbit as an investor, left as my husband. It took me far too long to realize he'd always planned it that way. When we first met, he was a guest speaker at a conference in Zurich, tall, tailored, and radiating quiet control. After his talk, he approached me backstage. "Your presentation," he said, "was the only one that didn't sound like marketing fluff." I laughed. "That's because I actually build what I sell." His smile, small, impressed, stayed in my mind for days. By the time I returned to New York, a bouquet of white orchids was waiting on my desk, with a note, "Dinner next week? I promise not to talk numbers, unless it's about us." I should have seen the red flag in that. But when you've spent years building walls, even a crack of warmth can feel like sunlight. We married 8 months later. Quiet courthouse ceremony, 2 witnesses, a photo that looked more like a press release than a memory. And at first, it worked. He was the calm to my chaos, the one who reminded me to eat, to rest, to look up from my screen long enough to live. He joined the company in a strategic advisory role, and our shared vision felt electric. But slowly, the tone shifted. It started with small things: board memos sent on my behalf, meetings I hadn't approved, decisions phrased as our choice when I hadn't been consulted. Then came the day I walked into the conference room and found my nameplate removed from the head of the table. Lennox was seated there instead, leaning back, hands steepled. Around him, the board smiled politely, the way people do when they've been briefed. "Alara," he said smoothly, "we're discussing a potential reorganization, just formalizing some leadership structures." "Leadership structures?" I repeated, my voice flat. "Meaning?" "Meeting," he said. "Delegation. You've carried this alone for too long." I stared at him. "You mean I built this alone?" A flicker, the faintest irritation in his eyes, then a smile. Semantics. That night, I lay awake replaying his words. Delegation, reorganization, leadership structures, business terms for takeover. It clicked then. The late-night strategy calls, the new lawyers he'd brought in for compliance, the way he'd quietly charmed board members over private dinners. He wasn't supporting me. He was positioning himself. By morning, I'd pulled every corporate filing I could access, and what I saw made my blood run cold. 2 weeks earlier, Lennox had filed a proposal to restructure ownership, transferring majority voting shares to a joint marital entity under his name. He'd married me for control, not for love. Shock has a strange rhythm. It doesn't come all at once. It drips. First disbelief, then fury, then strategy. So I made myself coffee, opened my laptop, and began undoing his plan, thread by thread. I called Elias Moran, my attorney since my garage days. He was the kind of man who quoted bylaws the way priests quote scripture. "Elias," I said, "I need to establish a blind trust, discreetly. All company ownership, IP, and equity to transfer under it. I remain the sole beneficiary, but it's shielded from marital claims." He was silent for a long moment. "Alara, that's bold. May I ask why?" "Because," I said, "I married a vulture wearing silk." For 3 weeks, I pretended not to know. I smiled through dinners, held his hand at charity galas, let him believe his plan was working. Meanwhile, I met with Elias every morning at 6 in a small cafe, uptown, the kind with chipped cups and no Wi-Fi. We built the trust in layers, legal, financial, and digital. By the time we finished, every patent, account, and share certificate had been quietly transferred. Lennox still thought he was manipulating a queen on the chessboard. He hadn't realized I'd already switched the board. The night before his plan was set to go public, his executive transition announcement, as the email draft on his laptop so confidently read, I watched him sleep. He looked peaceful, his hand draped over my waist, breathing even. How strange, I thought, that someone could look so human while plotting conquest. I got up quietly, padded to my office, and sent a single email to the press under embargo for immediate release. Vossian Dynamics announces structural transition to private trust ownership under founder and CEO Ilara Quinn. Then I attached the statement and scheduled it for 6 a.m. He woke before I did, as usual, or so he thought. I was already sitting at the kitchen island, phone in hand, watching as his world and mine began to shift. His phone buzzed first, then mine, then a dozen more times. Headlines flooded in like a tide. Ilara Quinn retains sole ownership of Vossian Dynamics in strategic restructure. CEO moves to secure independence amid internal power shift. Across from me, Lennox's face drained of color. "Ilara," he said, voice low, "what did you do?" I took a sip of coffee. I took back what was mine. The board meeting that followed was brutal. He stormed in, all righteous fury and feigned confusion. "You've sabotaged years of planning," he snapped. "You've made me look like a fool." "No," I said evenly. "You did that yourself." He glared. "You can't run this without me." I met his eyes. "I already have." Within a week, he resigned. Within 2, I filed for divorce. He tried to fight it, of course he did. He filed motions, threatened leaks, painted himself as the victim of emotional manipulation. But the trust was airtight. Every signature, every timestamp, every piece of digital correspondence had been secured months before he ever moved his first piece. His lawyers couldn't touch it. He lost everything he'd tried to steal. But here's the part people don't understand about revenge. It doesn't feel triumphant at first. It feels quiet, cold. The night the final settlement was signed, I sat alone in the office, lights off, watching the city shimmer against the glass. I thought about the girl who once equated intelligence with invincibility, who mistook strategy for love. And I realized I hadn't just outmaneuvered him, I'd outgrown him. 3 months later, Forbes called. They wanted an exclusive on the Vossian turnaround. I agreed, but on one condition: no questions about my personal life. The interviewer, a young woman named Marin Lowe, smiled knowingly. Of course. Off the record, though, that move was genius. You didn't just save your company, you redefined control. I smiled faintly. Control's overrated. It's clarity that matters. The article went live the next week. And there, nestled between analysis and industry praise, was a single quote that defined everything I'd learned. When a partnership begins as strategy, it can never survive as love. Ilara Quinn. Months passed. The company soared under its new structure, leaner, freer, immune to internal politics. I hired younger women into leadership roles, mentored them on what no business course ever teaches: how to protect themselves from wolves in designer suits. Sometimes I'd see Lennox's name in passing in some industry gossip blog or half-hearted startup press release. Once, he tried launching a consultancy. It folded within 6 months. I didn't feel joy, just peace. Because what he never understood was that power isn't taken, it's recognized and held quietly in your own hands. A year later, at a charity gala, I ran into him. He looked thinner, sharper. Success had been replaced by something brittle. "Ilara," he said, forcing a smile, "You look radiant." "Thank you," I said. "You look resourceful." He chuckled dryly. "You were always the better player." I tilted my head. "It wasn't a game, Lennox. You just mistook it for one." He nodded slowly, eyes dropping to his drink. "Maybe I did." Then, almost softly, "I did love you, you know." I studied him for a long moment. "I think," I said finally, "you loved what I could build." And with that, I turned and walked away. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. Sunrise filtering through the blinds, the city just beginning to wake. My assistant handed me the morning paper. There, on the business front, was a new headline: "Ilara Quinn appointed chairwoman of Global Tech Alliance." I laughed under my breath, not out of arrogance, but out of gratitude. Because somehow, in losing everything I thought love was, I'd found something truer: freedom. And this time, no one could sign it away. You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.